Сьогодні цікава розмова Уляни Глинчак із канадською авторкою Діаною Стеван, яка незабаром видаватиме третю книжку сімейної саги, яка базована на історії її родини на Волині та еміграції до Канади в часи Великої депресії.
Серія інтерв'ю про літературні вебінари Канадсько-Української мистецької фундації на тему «Сучасна література української діаспори», частково спонсорована Шевченківською фундацією. Welcome to our art talk. Today I am joined by a Canadian writer from Campbell River, BC, Diana Stevan. Hello, Diana. Thank you for finding time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me, Juliana. It's a pleasure.
Diana, you call yourself a Jill of all trades. Throughout your career, you've been a clinical social worker, a school psychologist, you've been actress and model, you've even been a writer for sports show. When did you realize that you have this need to tell longer stories and to write novels?
You know, I started with, as you say, I was a clinical social worker. I was a family therapist for 25 years, and always dabbled, always sort of wrote, and I got interested because of my acting. I got interested in screenwriting first. And so I was writing some screenplays. I had an agent in Toronto, an agent in Vancouver. I got close, I guess, to having my script produced in Hollywood. Jodie Foster was interested. And her agent, thought it was a good vehicle for her, but she passed on it. And then I decided to turn it into a novel. And before that, a friend of mine had wanted me to write a screenplay with him. And we tinkered around with it for a year, and it never came to anything, and I decided to turn that into a novel. So I had, the first one was A Cry from the Deep, which was a romantic mystery, and the second was The Rubber Fence, which was based on the screenplay that I had written that was inspired by my work on a psychiatric ward. So I guess your question, when did I start? Probably close to retirement. In the late 1990s, I still had my private practice, and I turned them into novels when I couldn't sell my screenplays.
So that romantic mystery adventure, A Cry from the Deep, was published in 2014, and in 2015, The Blue Nightgown, the novelette as you call it, and in 2016, The Rubber Fence, a novel inspired by your work on psychiatric ward in 1972. What is the most important thing for you to portray when you write in a novel?
Relationships. I think the conflict that we have sometimes and the love that we have for one another, and I guess that's always been my interest, is how we get along and how we don't get along sometimes, and those strong emotions, and I think that has carried me through. And then my recent work is, of course, based on my Baba's story, and I never thought I would write those stories, but I used to tell the anecdotes, my mother's stories, to my grandchildren, and my granddaughter, Chloe, who lives in Toronto, said I should turn that into a book. And so...
You actually are going a little bit ahead of my questions, but it's okay. I still want to go back to Rubber Fence, and I want to ask you a question about the protagonist. Her last name is Bereza, which we know is a birch tree in Ukrainian. Is that by accident, or you gave her a Ukrainian last name?
Well, I wanted to, I think sometimes those Ukrainian names are missing from, North American fiction. And so I decided, why not? I worked on the psychiatric ward. I certainly had a Ukrainian name. We've changed our name. We shortened it when we moved to the West Coast, but my husband is also of Ukrainian background. So, I thought, why not? But as I have a close friend, a psychologist friend, her last name is Bereza, and I used her name, and she's pleased.
That's great. How much is in your books? How much is it the reality, and how much is invention? Like, how do you balance these things? And do you have people recognizing themselves in your books and giving you some kind of feedback about that?
Well, my first two, I mean, they're all fiction. In The Rubber Fence, it was certainly based on my experiences on a psychiatric ward, and I borrowed heavily from my relationship with a psychiatrist there. He was the head of the ward. I certainly borrowed from him. I don't know if he'd recognize it. He's since passed away. But as far as the patients go, they were composites. Of course, it's confidentiality. I would never portray, a situation, true to, but I wanted to make it true to life. So they were elements I borrowed from the people that were ended up on the ward, and both patients and staff. So as a writer, you do borrow from life. You do. You can't help it. And you use yourself. I put myself in my character's shoes. Every single character, I put myself in their shoes.
I know some writers speak to doctors, any professionals, if they need to be in their shoes and portray that kind of character or profession. In 2019, your novel Sunflowers Under Fire was a finalist in the Whistler Independent Book Awards for fiction and semi-finalist for Kindle's Book Awards. And with this book starts your family saga trilogy. Tell us please about this, how it came to be, where did you get your material? This is a story about your babusa and her family living in Volhynia and then immigrating to Canada and settling in the prairies. We want to hear all about this.
Thank you. Yes, well, it's Baba lived with us from the time I was a baby till the time she passed away when I was 15. And I shared a bedroom with her. But she never talked about the old country. But it was my mother who was the storyteller. My mother would always talk about the stories at the kitchen table. And when she got older, I started writing them down. And I guess, again, I was inspired by my granddaughter who thought I should turn it into a book. And so I was very fortunate that while my mother was alive, I wrote all her stories down on my computer. I'd visit her and I would, take them down. And she did say at one point, this would make a good book because of what they had gone through. And yeah, it's interesting, Liliana. I workshopped it. I thought about the story. And at one point, someone said to me, well, your Baba wasn't anybody famous. You're not anybody famous. Do you think anybody would be interested in buying this? And I thought, well, it's a good story. I mean, good stories are good stories, no matter who is telling them and who they're about. So I started writing it.
And good stories are not only about famous people, but good stories are exactly stories about people. There are many more ordinary people than famous people around us. So the second book, Lilacs in the Dustbin, it's about your Baba was immigrating with her children to Canada and settling in the prairies. I read both of these books, actually, and you already spoke a little bit about Sunflowers Under Fire. The second book is so, it's so heavy. I mean, it's a great read, but it's, as I mentioned to you before when we spoke on the phone, you read about how these immigrants settling in the prairies, how they survive these long winters and then, like droughts and all these things. And you think when there will be any, it will become a little bit easier. When can they sit down and breathe? And you don't see that, and I think this is amazing that you portrayed it, basically told from the first lips how these people lived, because this is not only history of your family, but this is history of Canada, and not only Ukrainians in settlers in Canada, but all immigrants. So I think these are great, not only fiction but documents for the future generations. Tell me a little bit about the second book, how you research for the second book, and then we will talk about the upcoming third novel, which I'm so eager to read.
How do I research? I researched it the way I researched Sunflowers Under Fire. I used libraries. I talked to people who went through it. I was very fortunate that the little girl the baby who comes to Canada, who is now my cousin Jean, is now 92, and still very, very, very sharp in her mind, and she has memories too. So I talked to her and research on the libraries and internet. And I remember my uncles. I grew up with this. I was first generation Canadian, and we get together as many immigrant families do. And so I knew my uncles quite well, so I was able to really draw on those memories. and my mother's stories to, write their characters and imagine their dialogue. And I also read, again, John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, which is, based on what happened during the, Depression, the Great Depression in the United States, and 10 Lost Years, Barry Broadfoot, many books that were about the Great Depression and what happened in Manitoba. And very lucky as a writer because there's so much material on the internet now. I was able to access old copies of the Winnipeg Free Press and the Winnipeg Tribune that talked about the weather and what they were going through. So, yes.
Thank you. Tell us about your third book, which you are about to publish very soon, I hope.
The third book is a continuation, I guess, of the family saga, Lukia's story, but it's also my mother's story and my father's story. It's called Paper Roses on Stony Mountain. And where in the second book, the family is settled on a farm in Lilyfield, which wasn't far from the village of Stony Mountain, where my father grew up. And if you recall, in the second book, they meet at a community dance at the Rockwood Hall. And that was one of the things that lifted the people, the farmers' spirits, were these community dances. And so in Paper Roses on Stony Mountain, we have a continuation of some of the family conflicts and what is going on in the country. And it's also a time when World War II is starting. So what is happening overseas in Europe and Ukraine is very much on the minds of the immigrants. And so that comes out in Paper Roses on Stony Mountain. So my first book covers 1915 to 1929, my second 1929 to 1937, and this last one 1937 to 1943.
Looking forward to read it. On February 6th at 1 p.m., Ukrainian Art Foundation is having a webinar for you, a literary webinar. Which books you will be presenting and what our viewers can expect?
Thank you, Liana, for mentioning that. I'm looking forward to the literary webinar. I'll be doing a reading from my first two books, a few pages from each, and a little sample from my upcoming third book. And I'll be presenting a PowerPoint presentation to show the readers how I came to write this story and what kind of research I did. So there'll be examples and little anecdotes about how this came to be.
Thank you very much for your conversation and finding the time to talk to us.
Thank you, Liana, for having me again.
I just wanted to remind our viewers that to register for the webinar, you can write an email to info@kunstgallery.com or visit events page of Ukrainian Canadian Art Foundation Kunst Gallery. See you February 6th at 1 p.m. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Серія інтерв'ю про літературні вебінари Канадсько-Української мистецької фундації на тему «Сучасна література української діаспори», частково спонсорована Шевченківською фундацією.
Про ці книжки ведеться розмова з автором на літературному вебінарі Канадсько-Української мистецької фундації в серії 6 лютого. Хто не має змоги долучитися до літературного вебінару Канадсько-Української мистецької фундації «Зустрічі із Діаною Стеван», може переглянути цю та попередні події в записі на YouTube-каналі Ukrainian Canadian Art Foundation.